absolutely loved recording this episode, and I really, really hope that you enjoy it. I spoke to Gabby Brost of Wicked Strong about strength training and chronic illness and looking into powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman. She's so interesting and so smart, and I feel like if you are a hypermobile person or you have a chronic illness or you're neurodivergent, you're definitely going to get something out of listening to this episode. We discuss some strategies for dealing with training and working around like mobility issues or fatigue issues so that you can still get everything that you can out of your session. Really, really love this. It's a bit of a long one, but it's totally worth it. I promise. Enjoy. Gabby, hi. Thanks so much for joining me. How you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Would you introduce yourself to the listeners for me?
Sure. My name is Gabby. I live in Virginia in the U.S. I've been a coach for over a decade now. I run my own coaching company since 2017. I've been a competitive strength athlete for over a decade as well. I've competed in strongman, weightlifting, and powerlifting. I do coach all three still. Right now I compete just in powerlifting exclusively, but I spent the majority of my time kind of rotating through all of the sports. And I do love to do all of them. And then I am a full-time coach online. I worked in person as well up until this last year, and then switched to being like fully online.
You have EDS as well, right?
I do. I have EDS, POTS, celiac, Hashimoto's. I'm sure there's some other stuff I'm forgetting in there, but kind of the whole package with that.
Did you know about those before you started training, or did you kind of figure it out as time went on?
I didn't know. I did not have an EDS diagnosis until probably 3 years ago. And so I had started training well before that. And I didn't know that I had anything that was not like quote unquote normal. I just thought I wasn't very good at this thing, so I had to work a lot harder. And I would see physical therapists, I would see people all the time. They just kind of didn't know what to do with me. So I just kind of figured it out myself, and started kind of experimenting with things myself. And I've had a lot of really great, smart, awesome coaches who've been very helpful in that process as well. But it was definitely one of those things where once I got the diagnosis, I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense now. That kind of brings everything together.
I think that's a really common experience for hypermobile people with EDS, of spending years trying to do stuff and being like, why is this harder? Or why am I getting hurt? Why is this advice not working for me? And nobody being able to help you, and then you ending up having to figure it out for yourself. I don't have EDS as far as I know, but I'm hypermobile, and I went through a very similar process. I actually saw a physio once because I kept spraining my ankle like over and over again, like walking down the road, not even doing anything exciting. And I went and saw this physio, and he was like, you just have too much laxicity in your ankles, and it's because you've got too much estrogen, and you need to just take bee pollen, and that'll fix everything. And at the time, I didn't know anything, so I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I guess I'll go buy bee pollen. And then the more I learned about things, the more I realized that that was one of the stupidest things anyone has ever said to me.
Right? Yeah. I kind of have like a similar story. When I was in college, I kind of done what every, young 20-something person had done, who grew up socialized as a woman and who was like historically overweight my entire life. I just ran and pretty much starved myself to try and be smaller. And um, I had been running a lot, and I ended up fracturing the navicular bone in my foot, which is a very strange one to fracture. You fracture it typically if you like play like American style football or like do like long jump, like really ballistic, intense movements. And I had just kind of fractured it like barely jogging and walking. And my sports med doc at the time was like, okay, well, that's strange because you're like 21. Like, this shouldn't be happening. So she sent me for a DEXA scan. And it turned out I think I was 1 point away from like osteoporosis when I was like in my early 20s, because I had undiagnosed celiac. So I wasn't absorbing anything I was eating, really. I'd kind of put myself in this situation that was just perpetuating the issue constantly. And she actually told me, she's like, you have to start like resistance training in some form or fashion. Like, you absolutely have to. And my dad has always lifted weights my entire life. He tried to get me into it in high school, but of course, I'm a high school girl being like, "That's not cool, dad," and wasn't into it. And so, this was back when the internet kind of barely existed, because I'm 37, and so I went online. I think I found some routine from, like, bodybuilding.com or something, or some forum, like, the 3 things that existed on the internet at the time, printed it out because, that's how we had to roll, and I was working at my college at that time, and I would go in every morning with my little paper in my boot that my ankle was in and on crutches, and just try to do things, and just kind of figured out how to modify stuff for not being able to use one of my feet. And then I just ended up really liking it. And I was like, oh, this is actually like a form of exercise that doesn't feel punishing, that doesn't feel like steeped in this intense amount of shame. And that is actually like very satisfying and enjoying. And I look forward to doing this. And so I just kind of never stopped after that. I always kind of joke that, like, running is the reason why I ever found strength training, and like kind of changed the entire trajectory of things.
It's so nice that you were able to take that information and use it to start strength training, and not just start strength training, but end up being a national strength athlete. Because that is such a huge jump from like almost having osteoporosis because your bones are so brittle to then being one of the strongest people in the country.
It's kind of a wild ride, and I sort of joke all the time too that, like, I'm I'm a very typical, like, eldest daughter, recovering perfectionist, people pleaser person, and so I did not like doing things that I was not good at, like, inherently. If I wasn't good at something, I was like, "Well, that's just not for me." And lifting was really one of the first things that I was not good at, that I just sort of stuck with out of sheer stubbornness, I guess. And spending so much time, like, well over a decade now, just training kind of day in and day out, is something that I honestly did not think I would be capable of from a, like, psychological perspective, not even just a physical one, when I was younger. And so it's always like a really nice and kind of interesting thing to look back in what feels like an entirely separate lifetime ago. And I'm so grateful that I had, like, some really good influences along the way to kind of keep propelling me forward and kind of keep telling me, like, no, like, if you like this, like, no matter, what your competitive aspirations are, if you like this, like, you should stick with it.
When you were first starting, what were you doing to like work around injuries? I guess you didn't know about the hypermobility yet, but you knew about your bones. What were you doing to start lifting, get into trainings to avoid getting hurt or like to manage getting hurt when it happened?
I kind of like taught myself how to lift for a couple of years, and then I started doing CrossFit. And my CrossFit had a, like, barbell club, and I was like, "Oh, I like all that stuff way better than, like, running and pull-ups, so I'm gonna do that stuff." And my coach at the time was, like, helpful in helping me navigate that process in terms of being like, "Okay, well, let's say, like, my hips hurt or I have a back injury or something. Okay, like, we're gonna do, high box squats versus, like, regular squats," and things like that. And I don't know if it's the ADHD or the what, but I just sort of have a very strong desire to solve puzzles and to solve problems. And so I just kind of took myself as, like, my own experiment, and I would just, like, voraciously consume any and all information that I could, like, via the internet, via learning from other people, um, and things like that. And so it really became a process of sort of trial and error to see what worked for myself. And then once I sort of slowly started getting into coaching, that was a chance to be able to, like, put that voracious desire into something a little bit more productive and constructive with other people. And my background is actually in education and, like, being a professor, and also in, like, social science research and stuff. And so I kind of just took those principles and applied it to being a creative problem solver. But a lot of it was just kind of being like, I think this might work, and trying it. And then if it worked, it was great. And if it didn't, it didn't. And that was okay too.
Good coaching is about being a creative problem solver, especially if you're working with people who aren't athletes and are normal people or people who have disabilities or chronic pain or whatever. Because a lot of people will look at exercises and be like, that's impossible. I can't do that. My body doesn't move that way. And if you have some creativity, you can just find a way to do it, because everything is modifiable and there's a way for everyone to do a thing so that it works with their body. But a lot of people don't realize that, and it's what stops them from getting into exercise, which is unfortunate. So it's nice to find coaches who are really thinking about these things and helping people train.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I really enjoy coaching beginners. I really enjoy coaching people with chronic illness, with hypermobility, with EDS, who are a little bit more medically complex, or who are like returning to sport or just returning to exercise in general from injury, because the injury process, whether it's chronic or acute, is so multifaceted and complex. And I do think that there's such a lack of information about the ways in which we can do exactly what you said, like find a solution. We can find a modification. We can find a way to do something, and to like facilitate that process, even if it doesn't look like what we thought it was going to look like, or it seems like weird or strange or whatever. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as it works for that person and their intended goal and outcome.
Let's think about some examples. So if someone maybe hasn't trained before or for a really long time and they struggle with something like a squat because maybe their hips don't move good or their knees hurt, what are some ways that people can modify that to allow them to get the most out of still squatting?
Yeah, that's such a good one, because that's such a common one too. And I think people get really intimidated by squatting in particular because they see like real heavy barbell back squats, and that's certainly like an intimidating thing. But there's so many options in terms of where we're loading a squat, whether it's a barbell back squat, a front squat, a zercher squat, a safety bar squat, a goblet squat. Like all of these things we can modulate loading with, but we can also modulate ranges of motion. So it doesn't need to be ass to grass squatting if that's not accessible. We can squat to a bench, to a box. We can do whatever height feels doable. We can have different types of balance support to make people feel more secure in doing that movement so that they get more practice. And then that practice starts to build that competence, which starts to build that confidence to continue to like increase in that way. I have a very long-term client who came to me, and she'd worked with like a couple other trainers before, but she was kind of in that exact scenario. She she really wanted to do like powerlifting at some point, but she could barely squat to a bench. She just had some like issues with her hips and stuff like that. And so that's what we started with, was just squatting to where she could control, and she would come in twice a week and we would do that. And then, 6 months later, we could load that with like a kettlebell. And then we could load that with like our 15-pound training bar on her back to like a high box. And then we could put a little bit of weight on that. And then we could go to a 45-pound, like 20-kilo bar. And then we could put weight on that. And now she's competed several times and like is well on her way to squatting 200 pounds and gets nothing but white lights and compliments on her squat depth at every meet she goes to. She's such an example of the patience and persistence and enjoyment of the process and celebrating those little wins when we are going through that process of like, okay, this feels inaccessible. Let me find an accessible entry point. Let me progress appropriately. And I think like just considering load management, range of motion, and assistive support in whatever type of way that is are kind of the three categories I look at when we're trying to modify something.
I love that story so much. I'm so glad that your client was able to get that powerlifting dream. That's so exciting. I think a lot of times people will look at stuff like external support as though it's cheating or it doesn't count, and then either just not do it because they're trying to do the hard version, but then they can't do the hard version. So then they end up not doing anything or avoiding it completely because it's a thing that they can't do. And if they can't do the full version, there's no point doing anything. How do you help people kind of get over that mindset so that they can just do whatever it is that they can do?
That's such a great point and a great question, because I think it really feeds into the overarching sort of like morality bias that exists when it comes to exercise and movement and different levels of ability in general. And then a lot of the like all or nothing black and white thinking that we encounter, especially with people with neurodivergence, right? Like we're not good at nuance. It's not our forte. And that's okay. That's totally okay. And I think that exercise in the gym can actually be a really great, controlled, safe way to practice those sorts of skills that we can apply obviously outside of the gym. So if we have someone who It's like, well, if I use, balance assistance for my split squat, it doesn't count. My goal is always to kind of lead with curiosity and to be like, okay, well, that's interesting. Why, like, what makes you think that? Like, what about that is kind of stirring that thought in your brain? And just kind of listening to the person in front of me and seeing what their reasoning is and kind of being a little bit of a petulant toddler and just kind of asking why, because that's not a thought that's inherent to us. That's a learned thing, right? We have learned this concept that using assistance of any type in so many contexts is somehow a moral failing, makes us less than, or somehow worthless because it doesn't look like what things are like quote unquote supposed to look like. And so if we can kind of like investigate that belief on some level in the context of exercise, we can sort of facilitate that in a lot of other ways. And so if somebody's like, I don't want to use balance assistance, it's like, okay, go ahead. Like, you don't have to. And then maybe we'll be like, okay, well, let's try one with and one without and see how it feels. And then with the one that's with, it's like, can you feel how much more engaged you can be with this movement? Can you feel this a little bit more in your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings, like whatever we're focusing on? Can you see how kind of removing that demand for stability allows us to be able to load this a little bit more to progress this in a way? And also acknowledging that, like, we can use a variety of things for a variety of different things. We can use balance assist, we can not use balance assist. Both are totally valid. They're just different tools in the toolbox. One's not better than the other. It's more so asking the question, what is going to be the most appropriate for the task and goal at hand?
I really love offering people the opportunity to explore what something feels like for themselves. I do that a lot with clients. If they ask me if something is better one way, most of the time my answer is just try it and see. Does it feel better for
Mhm.
you? Does that seem like that was the strongest place or the most balanced place? Because I don't have all the answers. I mean, most of the time I am actually still right, but I don't want to give them all of the answers. I want them to try
Right.
and feel what it feels like, because that's how you learn. You're not going to learn anything if I just tell you. And if I just
Mhm.
tell you all of the things, you won't trust your own decision making. And if you don't trust your own decision making, it's much less likely you're going to feel safe and confident to go to the gym by yourself without me. And that's ultimately what I want for my clients, and probably what most of them want for themselves as well. Like, they're coming to me because they want to learn how to gym, but they don't want to stay with me until the rest of their days. They want to be able to go to the gym by themselves. And the only way people can do that is having that autonomy within the sessions as well to feel things.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely that. I just made a post on Instagram about this earlier this week is like, I never want my clients to stay with me forever. I do have clients who have been with me for nearly a decade and I love them dearly. And I'm so glad and like honored that they choose to work with me and trust me in that capacity and grow with me. But my ultimate goal is to provide enough education and empowerment and enough tools in somebody's toolbox that they feel confident to go do that on their own. I don't want to be a dictator. I don't want people to sort of just comply out of whatever perceived authority they see me to have. I want people to be engaged in the process. I want things to be anchored in autonomy and in the notion that like you are always the expert on your own body. I could be with somebody who has all the same things I do, etc. It still doesn't mean that I know how they feel or that I know all of these things because I am not in their body. I do not have their lived experience. I can't speak to that. But what I can do is stay curious, listen to the things that they are both saying and not saying, and act as a guide and support system to help facilitate the things that they are really doing for themselves. It's always such like a warm, fuzzy feelings when clients are like, oh my gosh, you like help me do this, or, they will credit you with something. And it's so sweet and kind, and like the intention is so good. And I always try to remind them that it's like, I didn't do any of this. I was here to like guide and like Sherpa you a little bit, but like you are the one who actually did the thing. And that required hard work on your part. It required trust and like honesty and vulnerability in a way that I think a lot of people underestimate. And I do take that extremely seriously. And so I always try to remind people like, you are the one who is in the driver's seat here. I'm just kind of like your map quest. Like I'm your Google Maps here, to help you get to where you're going. And, we may need to take alternate routes and stuff, and that's fine. It's always such an important thing to me that people feel that they don't need me. They can want me, that's wonderful, but I don't want them to need me forever. Like you said, I want them to feel like they can do things on their own.
I really love the analogy of like coach as Sherpa, because the role of a coach, as I see it, is to guide people, to support them, and to offer education, but not to like be dictating stuff. I think that's where a lot of difference between trainers starts to appear. The people who like really want to support and guide people, and then the people who are like, I'm going to give you this very specific thing, and then at the beginning and the end, we're going to take a photo, and you have to do everything that I say, absolutely down to like the gram of fat or
Mhm.
whatever. And if you don't do that, that's your bad. Because I feel like that is so unhelpful. Because firstly, you don't learn anything. Maybe you get shredded by the end of the 12 weeks. Cool, cool, cool. But like, you didn't learn anything. And then what happens when the 12 weeks are over? Nobody maintains the shreddedness because they didn't learn anything. And probably also it was awful because you were probably
Right.
in such a massive deficit. There's no way you could maintain that for very long. And it finishes before you get a chance to learn what maintenance means. And I feel like when people are looking for coaches and for support, they should just be mindful of that and how people are presenting themselves. Because if someone's like, get shredded in 6 weeks, they're probably not the guy that's going to help you learn how to do anything.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's one of those things that I've heard over the years of people saying like they want somebody who's going to be tough on them. They want somebody who, is going to yell at them and like motivate them, whatever, like whatever that means to them. And I will like be very straight up with people and be like, if you want a drill sergeant, that's not me. I'm not your girl. Like, sorry, it's outside of my ethos, and like that's whatever. But I think people often forget that, like, to ask the question of like, well, if you feel like you need somebody to sort of like be punishing towards you in this way to elicit these feelings of guilt and shame as a sort of like tool for motivation, even though we know that's not how motivation works. Like, what are we really searching for here? Because to me, that's telling me that there's actually a large opportunity here for you to build trust in yourself, because there isn't a lot present if you feel the need to hand the reins completely over to somebody else in that way, where you are not having any autonomy in that situation. And like self trust is just cultivated so much by keeping the promises that you make to yourself and showing up for yourself in that way. Exercise and nutrition is such a brilliant and awesome way to begin to cultivate that in so many facets of life, because it's those things where, you don't want to go train all the time. You're like, I want to stay in my warm bed. It's cold outside, whatever. And it's also the notion of like, okay, evaluating, am I prepared to do what I need to do? Am I fed? Am I hydrated? Am I well? Am I mentally in a space to do this? And if so, I know that I'm going to feel better after I do this because I have enough evidence to show me that. So if I can just get there and commit to doing one thing, great. That's what I'm going to do. But when people want this like 12 week 12-week transformation thing, the question always becomes like, what are we actually seeking? Is it building of self-trust? Is it the social capital and rewards and treatment that come along with things like extreme weight loss and that external validation? And so I think, again, like just being so curious and kind of leading with that curiosity to help people explore those answers for themselves, like within the scope that we can, obviously, um, is so important, because as a coach, that's just not me. Like, I just don't want people to sort of like obey me no matter what, because I am certainly not that person, in any stretch of the imagination. And I do think it's one of those things, like you said, that people sort of forget to kind of check on, is like, when you're searching for a coach or a trainer, asking, what is your communication style? Like, what are your, core values and tenets in the way that you speak to your clients and educate your clients and things like that? Because obviously not everybody's the best fit for everybody. And so if somebody is like, well, I don't want, somebody who's going to be too nice to me or something like that, then maybe it's like, okay, maybe I'm not the right fit for you and there's somebody else.
Years ago, I used to work in a commercial gym and I was on the bench with my client. She was benching. And then from across the room, we heard this PT who was a bodybuilder in like the depths of her cut, full of rage, yelling at her client, being like, "What did I tell you? Chicken and broccoli." And then she like grabs her arm and goes like this and she's like, "Chicken and broccoli." And she's just yelling at her. My client just looks up at me and she's like, "Please never yell at me." And I was like, it would literally not even occur to me to yell at anyone. What
Right.
the hell? I would die. If I was that client, I would die of embarrassment. I'm never going back to the gym if someone did that to me. That's it. It's
Mhm.
over. I'm finished.
Yeah, 100%. And like those type of experiences, when people have these really negative experiences with nutrition, gyms, exercise, whatever, it does like imprint on you. And then because of like the way cognitive bias works, anytime we go to maybe re-enter that thing again, we're so primed to look for those negative experiences because our brain is just kind of constantly searching to confirm that belief and make sense of that experience that we had. And so I'm sure you've experienced this too in just the populations that you work with of when you have clients who come from really negative experiences and they come to work with somebody like yourself, there's almost this like hesitation and this like extreme reservation at the beginning of that coaching relationship because they're still trying to find the negative and like validly so, right? Like there's nothing good or bad about that. That just is. And it becomes this really interesting thing as a coach to say, like, well, no, like I'm not that person. And I want to cultivate a container for you in which you can show up as your full self and feel safe. And I'm like such a big believer in that safety is like a personal and fluid determination. So I like never call myself like a safe space or anything like that. That's not my choice to make. That's not my designation to make for myself. Other people can make that. But it becomes one of these things where it's really hard. And I've been on the other side of that coming from like my first coach was super, super emotionally abusive to me. And it was really, really bad. And he is one of the reasons why I coach in the way that I do, because I was like, I never want anybody to experience this ever again. I can have a level of gratitude for my actions and result of that experience. But it is hard. And I think that holding a lot of empathy and validation for people who've had those experiences to be like, well, I'm not going to yell at you. And like, I understand that might be the expectation, but please allow me the opportunity to give you enough evidence to show you that that is not my expectation of you, and that is certainly not how I'm going to act in any ways. And also creating that container to say, hey, if I do something in a way that you don't appreciate or that feels bad for you, please come to me and tell me. I want to be able to facilitate good experiences for you. And I want us to have a relationship in which we can communicate that honestly and openly because I'm a human and I'm going to fuck something up at some point.
I think trying to like communicate that coaching is this two-way relationship is really important because if people can feel safe enough to tell you things, they're going to get a much better experience out of the coaching. Whereas if people don't tell you things, like if people don't tell you if something hurts, that it becomes really unhelpful
Mhm.
because then you don't know if you're making them do something that's making something worse. So I try and make it really clear that I am not a like no pain, no gain guy. Like if there's pain, tell me because I want you to firstly not hurt yourself. But secondly, I want you to be able to tell the difference between like my muscles hurt because I'm trying hard and my muscles hurt because I just tore something.
Mhm.
And if you can't tell the difference and then your hamstrings hurt, but you're still trying to get into the splits and you're like, this is horrendous, but you're doing it anyway and you're not telling me, that is not good because then you're just going to make it harder for you to be able to do the things that you want to do and making it so that people feel safe enough to tell you things is one of the most important things that you can do. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. I mean, I guess what I do is just make sure that I check in with people a lot and like ask them how things felt and ask them if like it made sense and what they were getting out of it. And then also other things to make things feel safe. Like I'll ask people what they want to listen to on the music. I'll
Mhm.
ask them if they want the fan on or the heater on. Like little things to make the environment more pleasant to be in. And it's nice because I have my own space, so I can do that. It's much harder to do in a bigger
Mhm.
gym. But those little things can just kind of get someone's guard down a bit, so then they're more likely to talk to you.
100%. And like when I was coaching in person a lot, like the gym that I train at is the gym that I also coached at, one of the gyms I coached at. And it's great. It's very kind of like old school black iron gym, but we have strongman, weightlifting, powerlifting, general population stuff. So many of us are neurodivergent and queer and all these sorts of things. And it's just like a wonderful little space. But especially when I was working with clients who were neurodivergent, or maybe we're just like really nervous about exercising, especially being introduced to barbell lifts for the first time. I think there's like a large level of intimidation there. Then if they have the availability, it's like, okay, well, why don't you come in when the gym's like mostly empty? That's fine. We can do that. Or maybe we're just going to like sequester ourselves to this one little area so we're not kind of moving all around the gym and you feel like exposed in that way. And just kind of providing the reassurance and also taking things as data. That is something I'm very big on, especially with my folks who are hypermobile and have like things get tweaky and stuff like that, because it is really easy to not differentiate between that sensation and that pain. And then the question becomes like, well, what do I do about this? And it's like, okay, well, like, what is this telling us? Is this telling us that, like, okay, we need to rethink our load management strategy? Is this telling us that, oh, you're having an issue with your elbow? Well, let me like check out your scat motion and your shoulder mobility stuff, because that's usually where that's coming from. And then we can address some things there to make sure that this actually gets solved. And it's not just like, well, don't do anything for a week and then it's going to feel better. Well, it probably will feel better after the week, and then it's going to feel like shit 2 weeks later when you're back to doing stuff. And kind of just leading with that and kind of facilitating a lot of conversations with clients of like, okay, like, what is this telling us? What is this piece of data telling us? And how can we utilize this to collaborate on a creative solution that allows you to continue to progress in the things that you want to progress without aggravating things too much? And having those conversations of like sensation versus pain, and learning how to like decatastrophize in the moment and make like a more objective evaluation. And then teaching people like, okay, yeah, if your knee hurts while you're squatting, let's take a beat, kind of evaluate. So we have a lot of different options we can do. We can do a box squat. Maybe we're going to pivot to something like a good morning even. Maybe we're doing Spanish squats with bands, whatever, like kind of giving them options for pivoting on their own, especially as somebody who trains people like largely just remotely, giving them those tools and saying like, hey, like, you're empowered to make your own training decisions. And like, I'm so interested to know how it went so that we can use this as information to design something even better together as we go.
When you're training now, after all these years of training, and now that you know about the POTS and the hypermobility, how do you manage pain days or fatigue days when your body isn't feeling 100%?
Yeah, that's been probably like the biggest learning curve the past couple of years for sure. Um, I kind of have a two-pronged approach, I guess. So I will typically be able to tell if I'm going to be able to have a productive and like quality session, or if I'm not going to be able to have that. So for example, like I live in, the US South. So in the summer, it's real hot and it's real humid. My gym does not really have AC. We have some fans. So for, somebody with POTS, it's not the greatest combination of things. So there are some days where I'm like, yeah, all the blood is pulling my legs and I'm not going to be upright here soon. And so usually if I'm like, mid workout and that's happening, then it's like, okay, can I lay with my legs up? Maybe I need to pivot something. Maybe I need to just kind of scrap what I'm doing and focus on doing some of my like rehab stuff that I do on the daily. And kind of always taking the approach of like something is typically better than nothing. And that doesn't mean that that something has to look like doing the most. It's typically doing the least to sort of like maintain not necessarily even just the physical level, but like the routine, the habit, the mental level there. And there are some days where like I get up and I'm like, yeah, that's just not going to happen. Like training today is just not going to happen. And so then my next move is always to be like, okay, can I just shift my training over a day and like do what know I need to do today to get myself feeling better? If so, great, I'm going to do that. If not, what can I combine stuff with to hit the things that I'm trying to prioritize that day? Or like that, training block or whatever. And also kind of going through thinking about what can I do even if I can't train the rest of the week? I'm like having a really bad flare, whatever. I'm gonna be out for a week. Okay. I know that me just laying down makes my body feel really bad. So I need to do something, whether that's like I'm going to set a timer on my phone and every hour I'm going to do like a couple stretches in bed, or I'm going to take my dog on a walk on the block, or I'm going to jump on my walking pad that's over here and like do that for 5 minutes when I scroll. Just kind of keeping that attitude of, again, something is usually better than nothing, and looking at those moments of like, oh man, I can't really do what I want to do, less in a defeatist way and more again as like a problem solving opportunity of like, okay, so I can't do this. I can't train for a week. How can I sort of like game the system a little bit? How can I like do the least amount but still make progress? And to me, that's like very mentally enticing. So any way I can kind of like gamify and like compete with myself in that way is typically how I go about that. And then just pivoting, so much pivoting, constant pivoting, and being very okay with that and being very accepting of that and knowing that, especially like as a competitive athlete, I don't need to do in the gym what I can do on the platform. I know that. I don't need to have the most perfect meet prep ever to have a great meet, and kind of just being okay with that, and also recognizing that in very high pain flares or even like mental health flare ups, when depression is really bad or CPTSD is really bad, kind of acknowledging that, like, okay, my brain is probably not the most reliable narrator right now. So I'm gonna let myself have my feelings and have these thoughts, but I'm not going to sink everything into them, because I know that there's an option to pivot. And I know that right now, like, my most rational self is kind of not in the driver's seat.
Must take a lot of work and learning to like not just fall into the pits of despair when you're having a flare up and when you can't train and you don't feel good and you just need to lie down.
And I will definitely say I absolutely do fall in the pits of despair. Like, like I'm absolutely a human being and that totally happens. And, I'm very grateful to have really awesome support system who can kind of help me, you know, at least, if not pull me up, at least sit there with me and kind of be like, yep, this really sucks. You are totally right. This really sucks. Because sometimes that's all you need to hear. It's like with chronic illness, like there's no solution. There's symptom management, but there's no cure. And I think that having the, I guess, like advantage of not knowing that I had a lot of these things going on until much later in my training kind of gave me this perspective of, well, I just have to do it differently, and just being okay with doing it differently and detaching the morality from that. And it took like having some pretty like not necessarily catastrophic injuries, but injuries that took me out of competing for a couple of years to sort of divest myself from being fully identified as an athlete and hinging everything on that, because I do think that that is one of the biggest things that comes into play with like exactly what you're mentioning of like not falling into those pits of despair is I have to remind myself that I'm a full and complete human outside of the gym. Like my 400-pound deadlift does not make me a good person. It makes me a strong person, but that's all it does. And that, like, the people who love and care about you are going to love and care about you no matter what you bench, hopefully.
Figuring out a different way of doing stuff is how a lot of people end up getting through. Like I was coaching habit coaching for my clients for a really long time, giving them all of these tips before I knew I had ADHD, where I was like, you just need to make it really easy where you put the thing in front of you, and then years later I'm like, I have ADHD. These are all ADHD tips that I've figured out to manage my own
Mhm,
ADHD. But they work really well for everyone. They're not just for ADHD people,
mhm,
because everyone struggles with habits. And I think the same with like training. If you keep getting hurt doing something a particular way, you have to figure out a different way to do it. And then it kind of branches. You either figure out a different way to do it or you end up not doing it anymore. Especially with like health issues, knowing that training makes them better, not like a cure, but
mhm.
makes your body feel better, makes you manage stuff better, makes you cope with stuff better. Knowing that can, for me at least, be enough to be like, you should just go do it anyway, even if it's not like 100%, even if you're just swinging your mace around for 20 minutes. Doing something is always going to be better than doing nothing. And if I do nothing, sometimes that's where I end up in the pits of despair, because I guess I don't know, maybe I'm getting some good brain juice from moving, that if I don't move, I don't get the good brain juice. I'm not
Mhm.
sure exactly how it works, to be honest.
Yeah, there's so much like evidence regarding the like benefits of exercise, even things like walking on things like depression and how it can change things like hippocampal density in your brain, which is responsible for things like, well, partially responsible for things like depression and motivation and stuff like that. And like when we bring in the ADHD component, knowing we have these sort of dopamine deficits, it becomes a little bit more evident in how we can utilize exercise to help, again, like manage things, because it's certainly not a cure all. And like there's so much really interesting evidence about how exercise is so helpful for folks with PTSD and CPTSD and all these sorts of things. And so again, yeah, I think like reminding yourself that I know that this helps me feel better is huge. And then I think the other side of that too is that everyone deserves their own best efforts and deserves to show up for themselves in the way that they would show up for other people. Because there's so many people, and I think there's got to be some Venn diagram of like, high achieving people who very much pour themselves out for everybody else, and like chronic illness stuff. That is almost a circle. um, because there are so many of us who are like, well, we would drop everything for anybody else, but we won't do that for ourselves. We can't extend that type of compassion to ourselves. And I think it is helpful to sort of take that pause and be like, okay, if this was anybody else, how would I address this? And like, why does everybody else get to be a human and I have crushingly dehumanizing standards for myself? In what way is that like in alignment with my general praxis or like worldview? And then two, like it's very much like, why are you going to be the asshole boss to yourself? That's not very nice. And so I
Yeah.
think like reminding people of that, to be like, hey, like you also deserve to show up for yourself, and you also deserve to like care for yourself in this way, and it is important, and you deserve to feel as good as you possibly can in every moment that you can.
Did you or have you found a difference in how well your body kind of copes and reacts to the different types of strength training that you've done? So like powerlifting versus weightlifting versus strongman.
Yeah, absolutely. So strongman, I really love strongman. I love the variability. I love that there's conditioning components to it. Very ADHD friendly sport, because you're always doing something different, right? And it's like 60 seconds or 75 seconds is the most time you're going to spend doing a thing. But I found that I got two pretty severe concussions in at the end of 2020 and have like a TBI from that. And that was really the catalyst that brought almost all of my health issues to light, was having those two pretty significant brain injuries, and both occurring in like fairly traumatic fashions. And so when I went to go back to training, which was almost immediately, which I do not recommend, but didn't know that at the time, uh, strongman felt so hard. It was so, the level of intensity tends to be so high with strongman that my body was not reacting well at all. And so I actually was just doing weightlifting for a period of time post concussions, because it was very mentally engaging, like from a technical perspective. And that was very helpful for me in like that concussion recovery. And also, I'm not like the best weightlifter in the world. And so I just can't lift as much as I can in like strongman or powerlifting. And so it was kind of like an automatic load modulation. And I found that, and I still find that with weightlifting, it's always very helpful for me in building stability in my shoulders, especially, and also in keeping me kind of like fresh in a sense, because powerlifting is obviously like very repetitive, no matter like how many variations you're doing. It becomes a nice break on my body to do some weightlifting when I want to. And with powerlifting, I found that I've done a lot of different styles of training. I found that my body responds best to a more like conjugated style of training, where I am hitting a lot of variations. There is a emphasis on submaximal work. I've always been a person who does not need to hit like my third attempt in the gym to hit it on the platform. And that style of training allows me to still train at a high enough intensity and push very hard in the way that I need to, without completely trashing me and having those kind of like big adrenaline dumps and like subsequently big like histamine dumps that can cause flare ups. or having that kind of like repetitive use stiffness that we can get when we're doing the same thing all the time. And it allows me to pivot a lot more because if I go in and say, like, I have a max effort squat day and I need to hit like a top triple at a RPE 8. And let's say it's just supposed to be like a regular low bar back squat. If I start doing that and I'm like, yeah, my shoulders, not about that today, that's fine. I can switch to the safety bar. That's great because the intention in that like style of training for a max effort day is not necessarily to set a PR. It's to just work hard and use it as a litmus test to see if the work is working in other aspects. And so this emphasis on more accessory work, pushing those things and pushing sort of the non-specificity of like competition lifts, I found has allowed me to train harder, get stronger, and just overall like have a better experience in my body than trying to sort of just push, I guess, in a more like linear fashion or high specificity fashion. And so for me, when I'm like in a bad flare, it's like, okay, weightlifting, always a go-to because I can. Um, Strongman, I like to keep some components in because they're fun, like some of the cardio components in. I find that my body does respond really well to being like well conditioned. And then powerlifting is, I know that at the end of a meet prep, I'm going to feel pretty bad, and that's to be expected. But kind of emphasizing that submaximal work, a decent amount of like variation and rotation through exercise selection tends to keep my body pretty happy in that way.
I've found that keeping in variety is one of the things that makes my joints feel the best.
Mhm.
I mostly train weightlifting, but I keep in a lot of like old school strongman lifts, mostly because it's fun.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably the best thing that I've ever done for my back because it's all weird stuff. And you can't go super heavy when you're learning a new thing, which is like instant volume control.
Mhm.
And then you're just moving weird. So you're just teaching your body to move in different ways. So then if I am cleaning or jerking and something goes wrong, it's more likely that my back will still be fine because it's used to being in weird places. And when I did some powerlifting before, I was obviously not very good at powerlifting and it was a long time ago, so I didn't know what I was doing yet. But I found that was not great for my joints because I was going like really heavy, but in like half ranges. But I'm hypermobile, so I was ending up further anyway. And then I was like, oh no, that was not good, not good. Now my knees hurt. Now my elbows hurt,
Yeah,
and that was a shame because it was like being able to lift loads is fun, really, really
absolutely.
fun. But yeah, I think if I did it again, I would do it much smarter. But weightlifting, I think, is perfect because it's always full range. And because it's always full range, it means all of the time that I'm training, I'm always training all of it. So then all of my range is getting a chance to get stronger all at the same time. And I think that's really good for someone who doesn't always know where the end of the range is.
Yes. And like with hypermobility too, we just are not very good with our proprioception, just in the way that like our, structures are. And so when I work with hypermobile people, especially like my competitive powerlifters, they always want to like squat to like maximum end range, but they want to do so by completely losing the tension and sort of dive bombing the bottom. And then knees end up hurting. We end up getting stuck like a halfway out of the bottom. And they're like, the nothing I do makes me go through that sticking point. And it's like, okay, well, you're loading a spring and then you completely let go. So there's nothing for your body to use. You're not building up that eccentric tension. And learning how to build intentional tension is such a huge part of like powerlifting for folks with hypermobility, because we need to learn how to keep the tension in the bottom of a squat, not only so we can like stand back up, but because it's going to help us with keeping knees happy, keeping hips happy, all of that sort of stuff. And like kind of the same thing with bench. A lot of people want to just kind of like let the bar dive bomb down to their chest, and they're like, I get here and I can't go anywhere. And it's like, well, we have no tension. We're operating off of nothing there. That's cool. Okay. So like let's learn how to generate that tension. Let's learn how to, utilize lats, low traps, which hypermobile people are terrible at. Like, utilize arteritis, all this sort of stuff. Utilize the things that should be stabilizing our shoulders, but actually aren't, in order to facilitate that. And a lot of that looks like giving a lot of like tactile cues. Box squats. Here's where the end range is. We're going to pause there. Tempo work, right? Or even with things like accessory work and stuff like that, putting bands around things so that you know where you are in space. You're getting actual real-time feedback so that your brain can start to make this connection to be like, oh, this is what this range feels like. And like I always tell my hypermobile people too, especially with something like an overhead press, right? Because all of us can like throw our shoulders way back here and like be wildly arched and all these sorts of things. I always sort of tell people, like, in your body, it's going to feel wrong and weird. And anytime I ask somebody how something feels, I'm like, weird is always an acceptable answer, 100%. Like, that is still information to me. And it's like, it's not going to feel right because this is not how your body has moved for the entirety of your life. And our brains and bodies are going to find the path of least resistance and of most efficiency, even if it's not the one that is like correct, or even if it leads to things like pain and stuff like that. So the neurological components of hypermobility when it comes to training and lifting become extremely important in that we're like getting better input to get better output, essentially, and kind of like learning those things. And it's a process and it does take a while. And it's one of those things that can feel very frustrating. And I'm such a big proponent of trying to get the most bang for our buck out of everything. And so if I have somebody who needs like, let's say they need more hip internal rotation to hit depth on a squat, they've got like tight hips. That's great. We can do stretching mobility stuff, which we absolutely need to do. And we can also internally, we can bias that internal rotation where we're doing things like a split squat so that we're not only getting access to those ranges, but we're exposing those ranges to graduated loading so that they are more tolerant in those positions. And we're doing kind of funky things for like exactly the reasons you said. If we're prepared to be in funky positions, when we get in those funky positions, it's less likely that like something not great is going to happen. And so like training spinal flexion, training rotation, training all of those things becomes important because of exactly what you mentioned. Like if I go to do a clean and jerk and I end up in some wonky position, but my body is kind of used to creating and generating stability in wonky positions, I'm going to have a much better time than if I don't.
One of the most important things for hypermobile people to work on is that like intentional movement and like learning where you are in space, spending time trying to like figure that out. And sometimes I might tell someone that they need to straighten their hips up and they're like out here, they're like, that is straight. I'm like, okay, I want your back hip to be in then. And then they put it in and they're like, this feels super in. I'm so far in, but now it's straight. And sometimes you just have to pick a different thing, even if it's not the real thing. It's
Mhm.
whatever the thing is happening in the person's body while they're trying to figure out that proprioception, because it's really hard. And I think as someone who's been actively working on it for, I guess, 36 years now, it it's still hard.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the best thing you can do is to just find coordination tasks that are interesting to you. I play with my mace and my clubs, swinging like
Mhm.
metal sticks around, and it is loads of coordination, and it's like learning where my head is and where my shoulders are, and like learning how to juggle, because then I have to know where my hands are. And these things are fun. They're games. I'm
Mhm.
doing tricks. I'm not doing exercise. I mean, I guess the mace is sort of exercise, but mostly it's tricks. And I think if you can find a way to do stuff like that, it can help you learn where you are in a way that doesn't feel really tedious. Because if you're hypermobile and you also have ADHD, you're not doing it if it feels tedious. And
Right.
that's the hardest bit sometimes, because you do have to do it, but you have to figure out how you're going to do it.
Yes. And I think especially with the ADHD component too, and especially in a sport like powerlifting and even weightlifting to an extent, because, we have these very set competition movements and they're not many. Like weightlifting, we've got clean and jerk and snatch. Powerlifting, we've got squat, bench, deadlift. Like those are always going to be in there in some form or fashion, right? If we're training for that, like, and we want to compete and things of that nature. And so, again, I think that's where like exercise variation can be really fun. Introducing sort of like different intentions and different objectives can be really fun too. So I really like to explain to my clients like why we're doing what we're doing if there's somebody who's interested in that. Some people aren't, and that's totally fine. But I like to say, hey, like this, wave of training, we're going to focus on, bringing up spinal erectors for this thing with your back, whatever. And like, here's how we're going to do that. So like creating that athlete buy-in, that client buy-in so that they understand, I think is really helpful for people with ADHD as well, because we're like, if it doesn't make sense, we're not doing it. Like, I don't want to do it. If I don't understand this rule, I don't want to follow it. That's just how it works. Like our brains are just like
Yeah,
automatic. No.
absolutely.
So like helping people see kind of the vision and see the trajectory and like where they're going, I think becomes very helpful. And then creating training programs and opportunities that again kind of like give you the most bang for your buck, especially with hypermobile people who are very like symptomatic, because we've probably all been to different like physical therapists and physios and stuff like that, and we have all the printouts of all the exercises we're supposed to be doing all the time, all day. None of us are doing that. Even when I worked in a gym 7 days a week, I'm not doing that shit. I'm just not doing it. Like my brain is saying hard pass. That's fine. How can I bring that into your training? How can I modify the intent of an accessory movement or something so that we are working towards that thing, but now you're not doing 30 exercises in a day or having to have these like separate pockets of your day. And even with like a lot of my folks who are returning to sport and stuff where we need like a higher frequency, or hypermobile people who need that higher frequency of neural input, it's like, okay, we're going to pick 2 to 3 things. We're going to do them 3 times a day. Do them after you eat a meal. Set a timer for 5 minutes. That's the maximum amount of time you can spend on that. Or it's like, okay, every time you pass your kitchen table, have a band attached to it and do this thing. That's it. Like making it so accessible becomes so important, because I think another thing for people too, both with hypermobility and ADHD, and kind of the Venn diagram of that is, if it feels overwhelming, we're not doing it. And I think exercise in general is a very overwhelming prospect to most people. And so finding those things of like, no, you can actually enjoy exercise. It can be a fun thing. There are so many options out there that you can have. And then two, creating that accessible entry point and that buy-in really helps people to be engaged in the process, because we know that starting is always the hardest part, always. And if we can utilize this forward momentum of kind of like, something is always better than nothing, like utilizing that momentum to keep us going versus operating these big fits and stops and starts and stuff like that, it becomes a much more enjoyable process in general. And it certainly takes a lot of trial and error. But that's also like, to me, part of the fun of it is because again, it's like a gamifying, it's a challenge, it's a puzzle to figure out, and kind of framing it in that way has always been very helpful to my neurodivergent brain, because then I'm motivated to actually figure it out and like find the solution.
Yeah, I love that. I love all of that. I feel like I could actually talk to you forever, but we've been here for such a long time now. So
I
I'm
know.
just going to ask you two more things.
Perfect.
Uh, the first thing is, have you had a DEXA scan recently to see how your bone density has changed since the first one?
I haven't actually, and I really want to, um, because I do know that it has gotten significantly better. There have been so many instances in which I probably should have like been significantly more injured or broken or whatever, that have not occurred. And I truly say all the time that strength like quite literally saved my life, especially in the situations in which I got my concussions. One was I was arrested at a protest very violently and like thrown in jail. The second, I was medicing, like doing street medic stuff at a different protest, and was pretty viciously attacked by an entire march of Proud Boys, who are like a fascist neo-Nazi type group here. And so
Terrifying.
the violence of it all, like being strong, quite literally saved my life. And there's been so many like PTs and stuff like that. I do have like some neck damage stuff who were like, yeah, if you basically didn't have giant traps and like a strong back, I don't know if you would, one, be here, or two, what the state of your like level of disability would be, because it would certainly be quite different. And so I'm very interested to see like what the actual tangible results of that would be, because I do think it would be really fascinating.
That's so scary. It's quite impressive that after the first concussion and terrible protest experience, which one happened first, the attack or the arrested?
The arrested.
It's quite impressive after being violently arrested, because I'm sure that was terrible. Police are awful. To go back and still be protesting, it's very brave.
Thank you. I had been really active in 2020, been tear gassed probably like 5 times. And a lot of it came from this aspect of like I am a very like physically capable, strong person. And using my strength in that way felt important. And I'm also a person who, like, lifestyle wise, has a lot less risk than other people. Like, when I got arrested, I got doxxed. All sorts of like not fun things happened with that. But I didn't lose my job because I worked for myself. That is not a risk that everybody else can take. And so it was something that I was like very, I don't want to say like happy to do because nobody like likes getting arrested, but it was certainly like a very intentional risk assessment. And then doing that afterwards was also a very intentional risk assessment of like, I know what is the possibilities are here, and I'm willing to do that because it was a way in which I felt compelled to show up. And I'm a firm believer that like activism has so many lanes and like not everybody needs to be out in the streets, like truly. But it was one of those things where it's like, okay, this is like what I feel called to do in that way, and how to like leverage all of this strength that I have into something that is also very aligned with my values and like the person that I am.
At the protest where you say you were being a medic,
Yeah. Mhm.
were there other people around when the Proud Boys showed up and attacked you?
Yes. So I was with 4 other people for like our little group. We were in DC, so where I live is about 2 hours away from that. And so we had been asked to go up there to provide just some aid, and like a street medic is basically just somebody who has like additional first aid training and supplies for, attending to like common protest injuries, helping people clear tear gas, cuts, bruises, lacerations. Some of us are trained up on like stop the bleed stuff for puncture wounds and stuff like that. Um, and so I was with 5 other people. We all got the crap beat out of us. I was the only person who was still on their feet, essentially. And we were like very lucky. We had like helmets and all this sort of stuff because we knew that this was going to be a fairly spicy endeavor. And there was definitely like a decent amount of people around. There were a bunch of cops around who ended up bear spraying all of us to make it stop. So that was another fun thing. Don't recommend that. Not a very fun experience in your eyes. But yeah, and
Hilarious.
like it was we were out of town, so we just kind of assessed everybody, made sure everybody was like relatively okay, and went on with that. But a lot of us, like especially my small group that I was with, kind of had like some lasting impacts of that, not only physically but obviously mentally as well.
That sounds terrifying. I can't believe that the police bear sprayed you as well. But that's fucking
Yeah.
insane. Yeah. Gosh, what the hell? When you mentioned the concussion the first time, I assumed it happened while you were doing strongman, and I was wondering what you could have, what exercise you could have been doing to be concussed, but this makes much more sense.
Yeah. And like I've worked with a lot of people post concussion now, and like post TBI stuff as well, like a decent amount of people. And there are definitely things like to do, especially with strongman, like where you do have a higher propensity of like incurring a concussion because you're lifting weird shit over your head all the time. Um, of like, as silly as it may sound, like doing direct neck training can definitely help, especially if you're hypermobile people, you've got that, cervical cranial instability there. And so there's lots of things that like can be done if you're somebody who is a little bit on the like higher risk spectrum for that, to train in that way. And I do think also that, especially with strongman, people get really intimidated by it because of the weirdness of it and like the weird injuries that can occur. And it has a little bit of a different barrier to entry than sports like weightlifting and powerlifting, but it truly is something that can be for everyone. And I think it's like important to note that like larger catastrophic or more serious injuries are pretty infrequent, and like against looking at all sports in general, they have some of the lowest rates of all that sort of stuff.
Have you kept some regular neck strengthening exercises in your routine?
Yeah, I do a lot of like chin tuck type stuff. I do a lot of work, not so much directly on my neck, but more so to engage low traps, rhomboids, and things like that, so that my upper traps are not doing quite as much work to stabilize my neck. Because we all have that very classic coat hanger pain where we have all of these very tight muscles because our joints are so lax that our body has to create that stability somewhere. So I'm a big fan of like chin tucks, doing like banded exercises. You can like put the band around your head and you can turn different directions. So those kind of stay a staple because my neck like will flare up on occasion. I just have like a couple herniated discs there. And so I can't really do a whole lot about them. They have improved. I have had like MRIs over time with that since I've gotten those injuries, and those have improved on their own, like with training and stuff like that, which is pretty cool because there was a very large portion of time where people were like, you can't do these things because you have this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, well, like all of the recent literature says that we know that like disc herniations and bulges and stuff can actually improve on their own, especially when we're doing things that can help with that. So I will prove you wrong and I will show you. um, I can do a lot of things out of spite when I feel like it. But yeah, neck training definitely stays as a regular thing in my routine.
I just love people who are powered by spite, to be honest. I feel like it's a
True.
really useful thing to utilize. If people are telling you you can't do something, that's motivation right there to then go and
Yeah.
do the thing.
Nothing sort of pisses me off more than hearing people have the experience of like a doctor or somebody saying like you're never going to do this thing again. And it's like never is such a strong word, number one. And two, even if we can't do a specific thing again, we can do something again. It comes back to that creative problem solving, right? Of like, okay, maybe I'm not going to barbell back squat again, but I can probably goblet squat or I can do something else akin to that since squatting is such a foundational movement pattern in our lives. And I think it's such a disservice to people who are injured or who are, have medically complex things to say you're never going to do this because it just paints one, the body as something that's made of glass. And bodies are so incredibly resilient and so adaptable. And two, it creates this psychological condition in which we're looking to fail. We're looking for all of the reasons why we can't do a thing. And it really kind of strips away the sense of like agency and belief in yourself that you can do these things. And like I've been very lucky to know a lot of very strong people who have come back from a lot of very catastrophic things. And I've coached, lots of people who were told that they'll never squat again after a knee surgery and they squat, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, or who'll never do these sorts of things again. And it's just like that's not true. And I think again, like we all deserve to show ourselves our best efforts, to show up for ourselves in that way and to like honestly kind of like believe and bet on ourselves in that way because nobody else is really going to. And so like you might as well because what's the downside? I get asked a lot like, if you have all these things, why do you do what you do and like to that level? And the answer is like, well, why not? What else am I going to do? The time is going to pass anyways. This is a thing I love to do. This is something that makes me happy, that keeps me healthy, that keeps me well in so many respects. Why would I not try to strive to be as great as I could possibly be at this? The other option is just kind of like wallowing in what I can't do, and that's just not a way to live in my mind.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. Especially if you're in your 30s and you're giving up already. That's a long time left to wallow because people probably live on average to like, I don't know, mid 70s. That's like
Mhm.
most of the time still. So if the time's going to go anyway, you may as well do something that brings you joy.
100%. And like, it's never, I tell people this all the time, it's never too late to start training, to start lifting. My gym owner's mother in law is in her 60s, 70s. She deadlifts like 140 pounds. She's super strong. She trains twice a week with one of my good friends who is a coach at the gym. And she actually had an incident where she fell off of her like garage roof because she was doing something up there. And the only thing that happened was she broke her wrist pretty mildly. And that should have been probably a lot worse. And her doctors were like, no, it's because you've been strength training for years. And like,
That's so nice.
which is, and like, that's what it's all about. Like at the end of the day is like, can we keep quality of life high? You know, being strong is very fun. You can do a lot of things with that. And you can just kind of, I love being able to go help somebody pick up a thing or to push a car if somebody is stuck or to just help somebody put luggage up on a plane, whatever. It's very fun and rewarding to have that in also like an altruistic way, like being able to help people with that.
That's so wonderful. What a lovely reason to be strength training. I I'm not as nice as you. I really enjoy being stronger than everyone else. So then when someone looks at me and they're like, "Hey, small person, let me help you with your luggage," I can be like, "Absolutely not, sir." Doing it myself.
Yeah, I love it. I love, like, especially as a very like high femme presenting person. I was just having this conversation with one of my friends and clients yesterday. I really, really do enjoy being like quote unquote too much in every aspect of the word. And I was somebody who grew up undiagnosed neurodivergent. I went to like an all girls Catholic high school. I'm the same person that I was then as I am now. So that's all that needs to be said there. And at the kind of the middle of my strongman career, I had actually cut down to be like 140 pounds as a lightweight. And I'm like 198. Like I was a very, very tiny human. And I looked very small and like very kind of like unwell in that way. And I was strong, sure, but I just enjoy being able to take up space. I enjoy being able to be sturdy and to do all of those things where it's like, oh, do you need help with this? I certainly do not. Thanks so much. Do you need help with that though? I'm very willing to help you. And I think that like, especially for people who were socialized as women, who are AFAB, who are femme presenting or anything along those lines, strength can be such an empowering thing in that way because it just allows you to really embody agency in like the most literal sense of the word. To be like, no, I am so like physically capable of doing this. And I think it is such a powerful thing to not be perceived as being super delicate. And it's kind of fun to like be a little bit unfuckwithable. Like it's a nice thing to be, especially now. Especially now.
Absolutely. That is the best advert, I think, for lifting weights that exists. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Where
of
can
course.
people find you if they want to
Yeah.
find you?
Yeah. So Instagram is probably the best place. My handle is GAB and then underscore Wicked Strong because my company is Wicked Strong Athletics. And then that has all the links for all of the things, whether that's coaching applications, I do consults, I do a lot of like programming audits for people as well. So maybe it's like you don't want programming, but you want to have somebody take a look at your program to modify it for hypermobility or ADHD or something like that. And then I have my links to like my writing Substack and all that sort of stuff there. So Instagram is definitely the place where I live the most. I do have a TikTok that is mostly just me shit posting and like occasionally some lifting stuff there too. But that is also linked there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. If you have enjoyed listening to this, lovely listeners, please leave it a 5-star review. If you didn't enjoy it, you don't have to leave a review. It is fine. And I guess I'll see you all soon. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.